November 1942. Out in the North Atlantic, west of Ireland, the crews of Germany's U-boats were among the most experienced submariners in the world. They had learned to survive by a rhythm they trusted completely, a sequence of sounds and movements that had carried them through attack after attack. And in the last weeks of that year, boats began to die in a way that fit none of it. A submarine would be running deep, holding steady, and doing everything its commander had learned to do. It would hear an escort approaching exactly as expected, and then, without the warship ever passing overhead, without the barrage of explosions that always came first, a single hard blow would strike the forward hull, and the sea itself would detonate in the one place the boat had believed was safe. There was no pattern of charges walking through the water. There was no ship crossing above to time an escape against. There was one blow and one blast precisely on target, from a weapon that seemed to reach out ahead of the ship that fired it, and the men who might have explained it, the survivors who could have carried the lesson home, mostly did not survive to do so. Here is the strange part, the part that sits at the centre of this whole story. At first, neither could the men who built the thing that was killing them. Pause on that for a moment, because this is not really a story about a weapon. A weapon is only the object at the end of it. This is a story about two ways of thinking. It is about a country that kept a little room, in its laboratories and its committees and its cluttered workshops, for the awkward outsider with the impossible idea, and about an enemy that, for all its brilliance, had built a machine with almost no such room in it at all. This is the story of the weapon they called hedgehog, and to understand why German submariners could not explain the thing that struck ahead of the ship, you first have to understand the rhythm it broke. Let us begin with the rhythm. For the first 3.5 years of the war, the entire logic of hunting a submarine rested on one weapon and one motion. The weapon was the depth charge, the motion was the pass. A depth charge was, in essence, a barrel of explosive with a fuse that fired not on contact, but at a set depth, triggered by water pressure. Sailors rolled them off rails at the stern of the ship, or flung them out to the sides with throwers, and they sank, and at whatever depth the crew had dialed in, they went off. They did not need to touch the submarine, they only needed to be near it. The killing was done by shock, by the savage pressure wave that a large charge sends through water, crushing hull plating and springing rivets and breaking men against their own machinery. It was a fearsome weapon, and it had one enormous built-in flaw that the whole German submarine service came to understand and to exploit. To use it, a ship had to steam over the top of its enemy. Think about what that means. The escort found the submarine using ASDIC, the British underwater detection system that the rest of the world would later call sonar. ASDIC sent out a pulse of sound, a ping, and listened for the echo bouncing back off a submerged hull. From the direction of the echo and the time it took to return, the operator could work out the bearing and the range of the target. It was a genuinely brilliant instrument, but it had a limit built into its physics, and the limit was this. The beam of sound pointed forward and down, but not straight down. As the ship drove in over the submarine, the angle steepened and steepened until, in the final 100 yards or so, the target slid underneath the beam entirely and the echo was lost. The sailors had a name for this. They called it the blind spot, the moment when the outgoing ping and the returning echo merged into one and the operator could no longer separate them. For the last critical seconds of every single attack, the hunting ship was effectively deaf and blind, running in over a patch of sea where it could no longer hear the very thing it was trying to kill, and the submarine commanders knew it. A submarine crew could hear the escort's propellers through the water, they could count the ship in, and they knew to within a few seconds the moment the enemy above them went blind. That was the moment to turn. A hard rudder, a change of depth, and by the time the depth charges had sunk to where the boat had been, it was somewhere else. The German commanders became masters of this. They learned to turn into the attack at the last instant, to use the escort's own blindness against it. A confident, experienced captain could survive attack after attack. Later in the war, one boat, U-427, is recorded as having endured something in the order of 678 depth charges in a single prolonged hunt and still come home. That was the rhythm the Germans trusted. Hear the ship, count it in, wait for the pass, turn in the blind spot, live. And the Admiralty in London knew the rhythm too, and knew it was losing them the war, because out in the Atlantic through 1940 and 1941, and into 1942, the arithmetic was going the wrong way. Britain was an island that could not feed itself, could not fuel itself, could not arm itself without the convoys. Food, oil, steel, aircraft, ammunition, the men of 2 continents, all of it came across the Atlantic in columns of merchant ships. And the U-boats were sinking them faster than the shipyards could replace them. The German commander of submarines, Admiral Karl Dönitz, understood the war as a straightforward sum. Sink more tons than the enemy can build, keep doing it, and the island starves. It was called the Tonnage War, and for a long and terrifying stretch it was working. Winston Churchill wrote later that the only thing that ever truly frightened him during the whole war was the peril of the U-boats. He was not being dramatic. Everything else, the invasion threat, the bombing of the cities, the campaigns in the desert, all of it depended on the convoys getting through. And the convoys were not getting through often enough. The worst of it came in the winter and early spring of 1942 and into 1943, when the wolf packs gathered in the mid-ocean gap that Allied aircraft could not yet reach and tore into convoy after convoy. Whole columns of ships went down in single-running battles that lasted for days. The men who did the sums in London could see a line coming, a point at which the losses would simply break the supply of everything the war needed. It was not a distant fear, it was arithmetic, and the arithmetic was close. Whatever was going to turn it had to arrive soon, and it had to work. So the problem landed on the desks of the men whose job was to kill submarines, and it was, when you strip it down, a very precise problem. The escort could find the submarine, the escort could not reliably hit it, because to hit it the escort had to go blind at the worst possible moment and give a clever enemy the few seconds he needed to escape. The depth charge, for all its violence, was a weapon of near misses. The official figures compiled across the whole war are brutal about this. British depth charge attacks are credited with something like 85.5 U-boat kills across more than 5,100 attacks. Do that division. It is worse than 1 kill for every 60 attacks. More than 98 times out of 100 the depth charge missed. Now the men in uniform looked at that problem and mostly asked for more of the same. More charges, bigger charges, better ASDIC. And those things helped, at the margins. But the problem was not really the size of the explosion. The problem was the geometry. The problem was that a ship had to pass over its enemy and go blind to attack him. To fix that, you did not need a bigger weapon. You needed a different idea. You needed a way to throw the explosive forward, out ahead of the ship, into the water the ASDIC could still see, so that the attack landed while the operator still held the target, and before the submarine ever heard the propellers pass overhead. And that idea did not come from a battleship or a naval gunnery school. It came, by a long and improbable road, from a soldier obsessed with an old and unfashionable principle of engineering, and from a chemist from the Canadian prairies, who had never intended to design weapons at all. His name was Charles Frederick Goodeve. He was born in Neepawa, in the province of Manitoba, and raised in Winnipeg, out on the flat centre of Canada, about as far from the sea as a man can get. He came to England on a scholarship, a young and gifted physical chemist, and by the time the war broke out he was a reader in physical chemistry at University College London. That was his world. Reaction rates and electrochemistry, and the quiet business of the laboratory bench. He was not a sailor. But he had joined the Royal Naval Volunteer Reserve, the branch of the Navy for civilians and part-timers, the amateurs, and when war came he found himself in uniform and pointed at problems the regular Navy did not quite know what to do with. He ended up in one of the strangest and most productive outfits Britain produced in the whole war. Its official name was the Directorate of Miscellaneous Weapons Development. Nobody called it that. Everybody called it the Wheezers and Dodgers. The nickname came, in the roundabout way these things do, from an earlier title heavy with the words anti-aircraft weapons and devices, which some wit turned into the instigators of anti-aircraft wheezes and dodges, and the name stuck. It was a department for ideas that did not fit anywhere else. It was full of civilians in temporary uniform, scientists and engineers, and, in at least one famous case, a successful novelist. The writer Neville Shute, who published under that name but was really an aeronautical engineer named Neville Shute Norway, served among them. They were, in the truest sense, the boffins, that wonderful piece of wartime slang for the clever, unmilitary specialist who turns up with a slide rule and a strange gleam in his eye and solves the thing the professional said could not be solved. Now here we have to widen the lens, because this is the heart of the whole matter, and it is worth being clear about before we go on. There is a particular tradition in British life, older than the war that runs through the country like a seam. It is the tradition of the gifted amateur, the parson who is also the finest beetle collector in 3 counties, the retired officer who breeds prize orchids, the bank manager who knows more about Roman coins than any museum. It is a culture that, for all its snobberies and its muddle, kept a little space open for the enthusiast working slightly outside the system, the person with no official standing and an idea that would not let them alone. And crucially, it kept just enough of a path, a crack in the door, through which such a person might, on a good day, get their idea in front of someone with the power to act on it. Britain in the war ran on this. Frank Whittle, who built the first British jet engine, was a serving officer whose patent on the idea lapsed because the Air Ministry would not spend £5 to renew it, and who was for years treated as a crank. Reginald Mitchell, who designed the Spitfire, did much of his finest work while gravely ill with cancer. The codebreakers at Bletchley Park, chess champions and crossword setters, and a mathematician named Alan Turing, who was as far from a soldier as it is possible to be, broke the German ciphers in a country house full of exactly the sort of eccentric the regular army would never have known how to employ. The pattern repeats and repeats. The outsider has the idea. The system resists. And then, just often enough to matter, the idea finds a way through. Now hold that thought and look across the North Sea, because the contrast is the entire point. German science and engineering in this period were, by any honest measure, formidable. Possibly the best in the world. The Germans gave the war the V-2 rocket, the first ballistic missile, a thing so far ahead of its time it beggars belief. They built the finest optics, superb tanks, and extraordinary submarines. Nobody sensible calls German engineering inferior. It was magnificent, but it was organised in a particular way. It ran through great hierarchies, through the state and the giant firms and the armaments ministry, through channels and specifications and the chain of command. It was directed from the top, and a system organised like that is superb at doing hard things it has already decided to do, and much weaker at hearing the awkward voice from below, the outsider with no rank and no department who says, quietly, "I think you're all looking at this the wrong way." The Germans had eccentric geniuses too. Of course they did. A young engineer named Konrad Zuse built a working programmable computer in his parents' apartment in Berlin in 1941. A staggering achievement, and the regime barely noticed. The difference was never in the raw quality of the mines. The difference was in the plumbing, in whether the strange idea from the odd little man at the edge of things had any pipe at all to flow through, any route to the room where decisions were made. Britain had that plumbing, cranky and clogged and reluctant. But there. The German machine, for all its power, largely did not. Keep that difference in your mind, because in a moment it's going to determine who lived and who died in the cold water off Ireland. Now, back to the idea itself, and to the soldier who supplied its ancestor. The principle at the core of Hedgehog was old and in official eyes thoroughly discredited. It was called the spigot mortar. A conventional gun or mortar fires a projectile out of a barrel, and the barrel has to contain the full force of the exploding charge, which means it must be heavy and strong and expensive. A spigot mortar turns that inside out. Instead of a barrel, it has a steel rod, the spigot that points upward. The bomb is hollow at its tail, and it slides down over the spigot like a sleeve over a finger. The propelling charge sits inside the tail of the bomb itself. When it fires, the bomb is thrown up and off the rod. There is no barrel to contain the blast because the bomb carries its own little chamber with it. That makes the launcher astonishingly light and simple. It can throw a heavy bomb from a very light mounting, light enough to bolt onto the forward deck of an escort without rebuilding the ship around it. The trouble was that the professionals hated it. The spigot idea had been floating around for decades and had been turned down again and again, and the man carrying the torch for it in Britain was a gloriously stubborn artillery officer named Lieutenant Colonel Latham Valentine Stuart Blacker. Blacker was exactly the kind of character the story needs and history keeps producing. A cavalry and artillery officer, an early military aviator, an adventurer who helped organise the first flight over the summit of Everest, an inventor who tinkered endlessly with weapons that fired in unconventional ways. He had designed a spigot weapon, and he had taken the idea of an anti-submarine spigot device to the Admiralty before the war, and he had been told, in the flat language of officialdom, that there was no naval requirement for it. No requirement. Go away. His work did not go entirely to waste. his spigot principle, developed with the help of another brilliant maverick, Major Millis Jeffress, who ran a secret weapons workshop so odd and so effective that Churchill fondly called it his toy shop, became a Home Guard anti-tank weapon called the Blacker Bombard. The same family of thinking fed into the shoulder-fired anti-tank weapon called the PAT. The spigot lived. But its journey to the sea, where it would matter most, was blocked by a wall of institutional certainty. There is a moment recorded from this period that tells you everything about what the idea was up against. When Goodeve and his people were pushing the spigot principle for anti-submarine work, one member of the Ordnance Board, the body that ruled on such things, is recorded as having told them that the spigot mortar had been rejected in 1910, and rejected again when Blacker brought it forward around 1930, and rejected yet again when Jeffress raised it in 1939, and then he delivered the line that ought to be carved somewhere as a warning to every committee that ever sat. He said that if God Almighty himself sponsored the spigot mortar, it would still be turned down by the Ordnance Board. Read that again. If God Almighty himself sponsored it, the answer would still be no. That is the wall. That is the thing the idea had to get around. Not a stupid wall. Not a wall built by fools. The men on that board were experienced and serious. But it was a closed wall. It had decided. And a closed system that has decided is the most dangerous obstacle an outsider's idea can face, because it does not argue. It simply refuses. So how do you get around a wall like that? You do what the British system at its best quietly allowed. You go around the side. Goodeve and the Wheezers and Dodgers took the spigot principle and turned it into something new. The genius of it was not the spigot alone. It was the pattern. A single bomb thrown ahead of the ship would almost never hit a small moving submerged target. But what if you did not throw one? What if you threw a whole volley, 24 at once, arranged so that they fell into the water in a great ring, a circle of bombs perhaps 130 feet across, dropping through the sea together like the closing of a net? That is what they built. 24 bombs, fired from 24 spigots mounted on the forward deck, thrown out ahead of the ship to land in a circle roughly 200 to 260 yards in front of the bow. Each bomb was a little over 7 inches across and weighed around 65 pounds, and inside each one was a charge of about 35 pounds of Torpex. The bombs were fired in a carefully staggered ripple, rather than all at once, so that they left the mounting in quick succession and struck the water together, which kept the shock on the ship's deck manageable and let the whole apparatus stay light. Torpex is worth a word because it matters. It was a newer explosive, a mixture of the powerful compound RDX with TNT and powdered aluminium, and the aluminium was the clever part. It made the explosion push and hold rather than simply flash. Underwater, where you want the pressure to last a fraction longer against the hull, Torpex was markedly more destructive than the older fillings. It was the same family of explosive that filled the bouncing bombs of the dam raids and the warheads of torpedoes. Into each little hedgehog bomb went about 35 pounds of it. And then came the decision that changed everything, the single design choice that lies at the very centre of why the Germans could not explain what was killing them. The fuse. A depth charge fires by water pressure at a preset depth, whether or not it is anywhere near the target. Goodeve's team did the opposite. They gave the hedgehog bomb a contact fuse. It would explode only if it physically struck something solid, a submarine hull, or failing that, the sea floor, nothing else. Now think carefully about what that choice does, because it is not obvious, and it is beautiful. If a ship fires 24 contact-fused bombs ahead of itself and they all miss the submarine, what happens? Nothing. They sink to the bottom and lie there. There is no explosion. There is no vast eruption of the sea, and that means there is no wall of churned, disturbed, bubbling water thrown up between the Aztec and the target. With a depth charge attack, a miss was almost as bad as no attack at all, because the explosions blinded the ship's own sonar. The water was so torn up that it could take many minutes, sometimes as long as a quarter of an hour, before the operator could get a clean echo again, and in that quarter of an hour the submarine simply left. But a hedgehog miss was silent. The contact stayed clean. The crew had held the target on Aztec the whole way in, because they never had to pass over it, and now, seconds after a miss, they could turn and run in again with the picture intact. Attack, miss. Attack. Again. The submarine got no respite and gave itself away with every move, and when a hedgehog bomb did not miss, it did not need help. One bomb, one contact, 35 pounds of Torpex against the pressure hull, and the boat was very likely finished. Not shaken, not rattled, hold. There was a further advantage hidden in the physics, and it mattered more than it might seem. A hedgehog bomb was dense and it sank fast. Faster through the water than the depth charges of the same period. It could reach 200 feet in under 10 seconds and plunge on down toward the depths a hunted boat would try to hide in. The quicker the weapon reached its target, the less time the submarine had to sense the attack and wrench itself out of the way. The depth charge, sinking more slowly and needing to be guessed to the right depth in advance, gave a clever commander those few extra seconds. The hedgehog did not. It arrived while the picture was still fresh and the boat still fixed. Look at what this weapon quietly abolished. It abolished the pass because the ship fired ahead while it still held contact, never crossing over the boat at all. It abolished the blind spot because the attack landed in the water the Aztec could still see. It abolished the warning because there was no barrage rolling off the stern, no pattern of explosions the submarine could hear building around it, nothing to turn away from. And it abolished the second chance the enemy had always relied upon, because a miss left the hunter's eyes open and let it come straight back. From the submarine's point of view, everything it knew was suddenly wrong. There was no propeller passing overhead to count. There was no barrage to time. There was no blind moment to exploit. There was only, if the aim was true, a single blow on the hull and the end. And if the aim was not true, there was nothing. A strange and total silence. And then the escort turning calmly to do it again. It looked from below like a ship that had learned to strike ahead of itself. It looked like magic. It was not magic. It was geometry and a contact fuse, and a chemist from Winnipeg who had thought hard about what a miss should do. The name, by the way, came from the look of the thing. When the bombs were loaded and the rows of spigots stood up bristling from the deck, the mounting looked like the raised spines of a hedgehog. There was a competition to name it, and the winner got a bottle of sherry. The projectiles themselves, in one of those details that sounds invented but is not, were made in part by Boozy and Hawkes, the famous makers of musical instruments. Their brass-working skill turned from trumpets and horns to bomb casings. But an elegant idea on a drawing board is not a weapon. It has to get to sea, and it has to be believed in by the men who use it. And this is where the story turns hard and human, because at first the men did not believe in it at all. Consider the situation of the escort crews in the middle of the Atlantic in the winter of 1942. They had been trained their whole careers on the depth charge. They knew its feel. When they attacked with depth charges and the charges went off, the sea heaved up in great white towers and the ship shuddered, and there was a sense, deep and satisfying, that they had hit back at the enemy that had been sinking their friends. Whether or not they had killed the submarine, they had done something. They had made the ocean shake. The hedgehog gave them none of that. A ship fired its 24 bombs ahead of the bow, and if the aim was off, nothing happened. Nothing at all. 24 bombs vanished into the sea and there was no explosion. No tower of water, no shudder, just the grey Atlantic rolling on as if the crew had thrown a handful of pebbles. It felt like failure. It felt like nothing. Men who had spent years learning to read the violence of a depth charge attack found this silent weapon deeply unsatisfying, and many of them quietly distrusted it and went back to the depth charges they knew the moment they had an excuse. The Atlantic itself made the distrust worse. The launcher sat out on the exposed forward deck, and in the heavy weather of the North Atlantic, the swells and the flying spray drenched it constantly. Soaked firing circuits misfired. A crew that pulled the trigger expecting a full ring of 24 bombs might get a ragged, broken pattern, with gaps a submarine could slip through, and never know why. To a sailor already unconvinced, a weapon that sometimes failed to fire properly in exactly the weather he lived in was one more reason to reach for the depth charges he trusted. The early problems were not only in the men, they were in the salt and the water and the want of proper manuals and maintenance. All of it had to be learned and fixed before the thing could show what it could do. The early results reflected exactly this. In the first period of use, the success rate of hedgehog attacks was dismal, down around 5 in 100, no better and arguably worse than the depth charge it was meant to replace. And of course it was. The weapon demanded a completely different kind of attack. It demanded precision, because now a ship actually had to hit, not merely be near. It demanded that the whole crew, the Aztec operators and the plotters and the man on the wheel, work together to put a small ring of bombs onto a small moving target they could not see. That is a skill. and a skill has to be taught and believed in and practiced, and the crews had neither the training nor the faith. Consider what that attack actually asked of a ship. The submarine was invisible, somewhere below and ahead, known only as a smear of sound on the ASDIC and a moving mark on a plotting table. The bombs would land where the ship was pointed at the moment of firing, so the whole vessel had to be aimed, its course and speed and timing all folded together to throw a ring of explosive onto a target nobody could see, one that was itself turning and diving to get away. It took a flow of information moving cleanly from the sound room to the plot to the bridge, and a captain who trusted the picture enough to commit to it. Get any part of it wrong, the bearing, the range, the moment, and the ring of bombs closed on empty water. As the war went on, ships were reorganised so that this stream of information had somewhere to gather and be made sense of. A dedicated space where one officer pulled the threads together while the captain conned the ship. When the sonar and the plot and the weapon were finally wired into one another later in the war, the accuracy climbed again. But none of that existed at the start. At the start there was only a soaked launcher, a sceptical crew, and a target that had spent 2 years learning to vanish. So the idea, having got past the ordnance board, now faced a second wall, and this one was made not of committees, but of the honest scepticism of fighting men who had been let down before by clever gadgets from London. The way through the second wall was the same as the way through the first. Somebody who understood the weapon had to get to the men and change their minds. The Wheezers and Dodgers did not just hand the thing over and walk away. They sent people out to the escort bases. There was a great gathering point for the Atlantic escorts at Londonderry, in the north of Ireland, and it was there, and at bases like it, that the patient work was done. Officers who understood the weapon went aboard the ships and to the training establishments and explained again and again what the contact fuse meant, and why a silent miss was not a failure but an opportunity, and how to run the attack so that the bombs actually landed on the target. They passed on the accounts of the crews who had made it work. They turned a distrusted gadget into a taught discipline. So determined was the Navy to see it used that a directive went out requiring escort captains to explain, in writing, why they had not used hedgehog on an underwater contact when they had the chance. And once the men learned to use it, the numbers moved, and they did not move a little. They moved enormously. Here are the figures that history records, and they are worth stating plainly. Across the war, British hedgehog attacks are credited with something on the order of 47 U-boat kills in around 268 attacks. Set that against the depth charge, with its 85.5 kills across more than 5,100 attacks. The depth charge killed a submarine in fewer than 2 attacks in 100. The hedgehog, once its crews knew their business, killed in something close to 1 attack in 5, and by some reckonings the best crews did better still. A weapon that had begun with a shameful 5% success rate became, in skilled hands, perhaps the single most efficient submarine killer a surface ship carried. Think about what that means for a convoy. Every escort was precious. There were never enough of them. A weapon that turned roughly 1 attack in 50 into roughly 1 attack in 5 did not just improve the odds a little, it multiplied the killing power of the entire escort fleet many times over without building a single new ship. And it changed what it was like to be hunted, which is where the title of this story finally comes home. The German submariners had built their survival on a sequence of expectations. The sound of the propellers growing louder, the pass directly overhead, the blind moment they could exploit, the barrage they could hear and turn away from. Every one of those expectations was correct against the depth charge, and every one of them was now false. A boat under hedgehog attack heard the ship come on, and then, instead of the propellers crossing over and fading, there came a single hammer blow on the hull, forward, ahead of where the sound had been, and the water tore itself apart exactly where the boat was. No barrage had warned it. No over-the-top run had let it time a turn. The blow arrived before the ship ever reached it, and that is precisely why the confusion could not resolve itself, why the lesson could not be passed up the chain the way so many hard-won lessons had been before. When a depth charge nearly got a crew, the crew survived to study it, to work out what the enemy had done, and to warn the other boats. A hedgehog hit rarely left that survivor. The very feature that made the weapon so lethal, the single clean contact blow, tended to kill an entire crew and leave no one to interrogate, no one to carry the account home. The knowledge that might have explained it went to the bottom with the men who had briefly held it. Here the story has to be told straight, and a British audience that knows its history deserves nothing less. There is no rich archive of German submariners describing, in their own words, the terror of a hedgehog attack, precisely because so few lived through one. The silence in the record is real, and it is grim, and it is itself part of the truth of the weapon. What can be stated on solid ground is what the Allied designers and tacticians said about their own creation, that it gave no warning that it struck while contact was still held, that it broke the pattern the enemy had learned to survive. The confusion below the waves was the direct and provable consequence of the geometry. The private human detail of it is something history mostly took to the seabed, and it is more honest to say so than to put invented words into dead men's mouths. The ships and the moments where the weapon proved itself were real, crewed by real men, and they belong in the account. There is a myth to clear away first, and clearing it away is a mark of respect for the truth. You will sometimes read that the first hedgehog kill was scored by the destroyer Westcott, when she sank a submarine called U-581 off the Azores in February of 1942. It is a tidy story, and it is wrong. The prototype hedgehog had indeed been trialled aboard Westcott, but the sinking of U-581 was not a hedgehog kill. That boat was driven to the surface by depth charges, then rammed by Westcott, and finally scuttled by her own crew. Most of her men were pulled from the sea and survived. It was a depth charge and a ramming action, not the new weapon. The serious weapon histories are clear that there were no confirmed hedgehog kills at all, until around November of 1942, after the device had been fitted to something like 100 ships and the crews had begun, slowly, to learn it. And in one of those gaps that honest history has to admit, the specific ship that scored that very first true hedgehog kill is not cleanly named in the accessible records. We know the weapon began to kill in the closing weeks of 1942. We cannot always put a proud name to the first of them. That too is the truth, and it is better than a convenient fiction. What can be named, with confidence, are the successes that came as 1943 unfolded, and the crews grew deadly with the new weapon. The destroyer Hesperus, under a commander who became well known for his aggression, made expert use of the weapon in the spring of 1943, and is credited with destroying more than one submarine with it in that period, including the boat known as U-191 in April of that year. The destroyer Wanderer used Hedgehog in a series of actions through 1943 and into 1944. Ship after ship the tally grew, as the thing the men had once distrusted became a thing they relied upon. And there was one officer, above all others, in whose hands the whole hunting art, hedgehog included, reached its deadliest expression. His name was Captain Frederick John Walker, though the whole Navy knew him as Johnny Walker after the whiskey. Before the war, he had very nearly been thrown on the scrap heap. He was what the service called a passed-over commander, a man not chosen for promotion, whose career looked set to end quietly and without distinction. He had clashed with a superior on a battleship and been written off, and then the war gave him the thing he had always been good at and never been allowed to show, the hunting of submarines, in command first of an escort group protecting convoys, and then of the second support group, a roving pack of sloops built to hunt U-boats rather than merely guard the merchantmen. Walker became the most successful submarine killer of the entire war on the Allied side. His own sloop, the Starling, took part in the destruction of more U-boats than any other single warship of any nation in the whole conflict. Walker's ships used every tool they had, the depth charge, the coordinated attack he refined into a deadly art, and the Hedgehog. On the 2nd of June, 1943, the Starling and the sloop Wild Goose worked together to sink the boat known as U-202 southwest of Ireland, using a combination of Hedgehog projectiles and depth charges. 30 of the submarine's 46 men were pulled alive from the sea. In the space of a single extraordinary patrol early in 1944, Walker's group sank 6 U-boats, 3 of them within about 16 hours. He drove himself without mercy, standing on his bridge through action after action, taking no rest that he could avoid, and in the end it killed him as surely as it killed the enemy. On the 9th of July, 1944, worn out completely, Captain Walker died of a stroke that the doctors and everyone who knew him attributed to sheer exhaustion. He was 48. His funeral filled Liverpool Cathedral, and his body was carried out to be buried at sea from the deck of the destroyer Hesperus, the very ship whose crew had made such expert use of the forward-throwing weapon he had helped bring into the fight. The weapon was not flawless, and honesty demands the darker side be named as well. It depended on a live contact fuse sitting on a deck crowded with men, and now and then it turned on its own crew. The clearest case came on the 20th of September 1943. The destroyer Escapade had stopped to help the frigate Legan, whose stern had just been blown off by a German homing torpedo. Escapade found the submarine responsible and fired her Hedgehog, and one of the bombs detonated the instant it left its spigot directly above the bows. The explosion tore the front of the ship apart. 16 of her men were killed and 9 were wounded, and yet, in a detail that says a great deal about the men of the escorts, the shattered Escapade still managed to take the crippled Legan under tow and drag her back to Northern Ireland. Every real advance in that war was paid for somewhere, and this one was no exception. And this brings us to the wider battle, because Hedgehog did not win the Atlantic on its own, and it would be false to claim it did. It arrived as one instrument in a whole orchestra of new ideas that came together, almost all at once in the first half of 1943, and turned the long defeat into a sudden and shattering victory. Consider what the Allies brought to bear in those months. There was radar small enough and sharp enough to fit in an aircraft and find a surfaced U-boat at night. There was the Lee Light, a powerful searchlight fitted to patrol aircraft, so that the radar could guide the plane in and the light could snap on at the last moment and pin the submarine in its glare. There was high-frequency direction finding, the equipment the sailors nicknamed Huff Duff, which could take a bearing on a U-boat's own radio transmissions and point the escort straight at it. There were the small escort carriers, merchant hulls fitted with a flight deck that brought air cover into the middle of the ocean, into the deadly gap that land-based aircraft could not reach. There were the very long-range Liberator bombers that finally closed that mid-ocean air gap from the shore. And behind all of it, unseen and decisive, there were the codebreakers, reading the enemy's signals and routing the convoys around the waiting wolf packs. Hedgehog was the close-in killer at the end of this chain. The other systems found the U-boat and brought the escort to it. Hedgehog was increasingly the weapon that finished the job when the escort arrived, and the combined effect of all of it, arriving together, produced the moment the German submarine service never recovered from. They called it Black May. In May of 1943, the U-boats went out against the convoys as they always had, and they were slaughtered. In that single month, the Germans lost around 43 submarines, something close to a quarter of their entire operational strength, for a price that could not be sustained. Dönitz, who had understood the war as a matter of arithmetic, now faced arithmetic that had turned and was devouring his own force. Late that month, he pulled the bulk of his boats out of the North Atlantic. He admitted, in effect, that the Battle of the Atlantic had been lost. The convoys, which had been dying, began to come through. The island would be fed and fueled and armed, and the invasion of Europe, which every later plan depended upon, became possible because the sea lanes had been won. That is the scale of what these converging inventions achieved, and Hedgehog earned its place among them. The Germans did not simply absorb the blow and do nothing. Faced with escorts that could now strike them while still holding contact, and with aircraft that could find them on the surface by radar and light, the Kriegsmarine pushed forward its own program of acoustic homing torpedoes in 1943, beginning with the weapon they called the Fulk. These torpedoes steered themselves toward the sound of a ship's propellers, and they let a submerged boat strike back at an escort without ever raising a periscope. It was the frigate Legan, whose rescue cost Escapade so dearly, that had felt one of these new weapons. The war under the Atlantic had become a contest of invention, answered by invention, each side reaching for the idea that would undo the other's last advantage. There is one more weapon worth mentioning briefly, so that the picture is complete and accurate, because Hedgehog had a successor that took its idea further. It was called Squid. Where Hedgehog threw contact-fused bombs and relied on a direct hit, Squid fired 3 very large depth bombs ahead of the ship in a tight triangular pattern, and it was cleverly linked to the sonar so that the depth of the explosion was set automatically, right up to the instant of firing, based on where the target actually was. Per salvo, Squid was even more lethal than Hedgehog. Its first success came in the summer of 1944, when the frigate Loch Killin used it to destroy the boat known as U-333. The forward-throwing idea that had begun with a stubborn colonel and a chemist from Manitoba ended the war as the standard, the future, the way it would be done from then on. The idea spread far beyond the escorts too. When the Allies came ashore in Normandy in June of 1944, specialised landing craft were fitted with banks of Hedgehog-type projectors, not to hunt submarines, but to hurl explosive ahead of the assault and blow gaps in the beach obstacles and wire. The forward-throwing spigot had become a tool for cracking open a coastline. and long after the war, the same lineage lived on. The three-barreled mortar gave way in the 1950s to a heavier successor, and versions of the ahead-throwing weapon stayed in service with navies on both sides of the Atlantic, well into the age of the guided missile. An idea the Ordnance Board had refused for the better part of half a century ended up outliving almost everyone who had ever argued about it. And here one more clear line has to be drawn, because the history is often muddled on this point and precision matters. There was another new submarine killer that appeared in 1943, an air-dropped weapon, largely American, called officially a mine for the sake of secrecy, but known to its handlers as Fido. It was a homing torpedo. Dropped from an aircraft, it listened for the sound of a submarine's own propellers and steered itself toward them. It was a brilliant and deadly device. It sank dozens of boats, and its first success came when a Royal Air Force Liberator used it to destroy the boat known as U-456 in May of 1943. But it was an entirely different thing from Hedgehog. Fido was dropped from the air and chased its target by sound. Hedgehog was fired from a ship's deck and struck ahead by geometry. They are cousins in effect and strangers in method, and they should never be confused. The weapon that struck ahead of ships, the weapon that broke the rhythm, the weapon of this story, is Hedgehog. Now the verdict, and it has to be an honest one, because the temptation with a story like this is to turn it into a simple tale of clever Britons and baffled Germans, and that is not what happened, and it would insult the intelligence of anyone who knows the period. The Germans were not fools. The men who built the U-boats were superb engineers, and the men who crewed them were, for most of the war, among the most skilled and daring submariners in the world. The doctrine they had built, the rhythm of hearing the ship and timing the pass and turning in the blind spot, was not stupidity. It was a correct and rational response to the weapon they actually faced, the depth charge, and against that weapon it worked, and it kept thousands of them alive. They were beaten not because they were inferior, but because the problem changed underneath them, suddenly and invisibly, and the change came from a direction their entire system was poorly built to anticipate. That is the real verdict, and it is a verdict about systems, not about the worth of nations or men. The Germans had the drawings and the discipline and the mighty industrial machine. The British had a colonel obsessed with an unfashionable principle, and a chemist from the prairies who asked what a miss ought to do. The Germans had a way of running things that was magnificent at executing decisions from the top, and poor at hearing the awkward voice from below. The British had a way of running things that was maddening and slow and full of ordnance boards that would refuse God Almighty himself, and yet kept, somewhere in its untidy machinery, a crack through which the outsider's idea could pass. Blacker was told there was no requirement, and the spigot lived anyway. The Ordnance Board said no for the third time, and Goody found another way. The escort crews distrusted the silent weapon, and patient men went out to Londonderry and won them over one ship at a time. That is not the story of a cleverer people, it is the story of a more open system, and openness, in a long war of invention, turned out to be a kind of weapon in itself. A country that leaves a little room for its eccentrics, that keeps a door ajar for the strange idea, will now and then produce a thing that a tidier and more powerful enemy simply cannot answer in time. That is the lesson under the water. Not that one nation was better, but that one kind of system could hear the outsider, and the other, for all its brilliance, could not. And now, the cost, because no honest telling ends on a clever verdict without counting what was paid. Every U-boat that Hedgehog sank was a steel tube full of men. The German submarine service suffered the most appalling casualty rate of any arm of any service in the entire war. Of the roughly 40,000 men who went to sea in the U-boats, close to 3 in 4 did not come back. They were young, most of them, and they died in the cold and the dark and the crushing pressure, often without ever seeing the ship that killed them, sometimes, as we have seen, without even understanding the weapon that had struck them. Whatever one thinks of the cause they served, and it was a terrible cause, the manner of their dying was as grim as anything the war produced, and a weapon valued precisely because it left so few survivors is a weapon whose success should be stated soberly and not cheered. On the other side of it were the men of the convoys and their escorts, the merchant sailors who crossed and recrossed that ocean, knowing what waited beneath it, the escort crews who spent the freezing nights straining at the Aztec sets, and the unmilitary inventors ashore who never fired a shot, and yet changed the arithmetic of the whole war from a laboratory and a workshop. It is right to name a few of them and to let their names stand. Charles Frederick Goodeve, the chemist from Winnipeg who asked the right question about the fuse and thought in patterns instead of single shots, was appointed to high scientific office in the Admiralty before the war ended and was knighted after it. He spent his later years advancing British science and industry and gave his name to no famous battle, only to the quiet business of thinking clearly under pressure. He died in 1980. Lieutenant Colonel Latham Valentine Stuart Blacker, the stubborn officer with the unfashionable principle, lived to see the spigot mortar he had championed for so long become a family of weapons that armed the Home Guard, killed tanks, and hunted submarines across an ocean. The nation that had told him there was no requirement eventually paid him, through its Commission on Awards to Inventors, for the requirement it turned out to have, and the frigates and destroyers and their crews, the Hesperus and the Wanderer, and the many others whose names fill the convoy records, did the hard and unglamorous work of taking a distrusted weapon and learning, in freezing water and mortal danger, how to make it strike true. The tacticians who went out to the escort bases and taught them, patiently, that a silent miss was a chance and not a failure, are almost entirely nameless now, and they changed the war as surely as any admiral. So the answer to the question this story began with turns out to be simple, and it is not really about torpedoes or fuses or pounds of Torpex at all. German submariners could not explain the weapon that struck ahead of their ships because the explanation did not live in the sea. It lived in a back room in London, in a department of amateurs with a comic nickname, where a rejected idea from an overlooked man had finally been allowed into the room. Their enemy had built a superb machine for war and left almost no space in it for that kind of man. Britain, for all its faults, had kept the space, and in the end the space was worth a fleet. If your father or your grandfather served in the escorts of the Atlantic, on the corvettes and frigates and destroyers that shepherded the convoys through, or in the merchant navy that made the crossing again and again, or in the strange scientific establishments ashore that armed them, their part in this is real and it deserves to be remembered. The memory of what these people did survives only as long as it is spoken of. That work and those crossings and the quiet cleverness that tipped the balance under the grey Atlantic are worth keeping alive a while longer.